let's bring in retired four-star General Jack Keane, former Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, now Chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, and Fox News senior strategic analyst, and one of the best people to talk to, who has really studied and watched every moment of the development of this war. So, General, it's very good to have you with us. What's your reaction to what happened today?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say I associate myself with Secretary Pompeo's comments, and I just add a couple of thoughts. Number one, no president has ever experienced what Zelensky's experienced. 3 years of war in his country. He's attacked by the most powerful country in Europe, has a much larger military. He outguns the Ukrainians, and he's watched their people suffer on a regular basis. He always goes to the front, to help his troops in terms of their spirit and morale, but it's got to take a toll on him to see the suffering that's taken place among his people. The only president that comes close to that is Abraham Lincoln due to our Civil War. That is one thing. The second thing is, he should have understood going into the Oval Office today that when the cameras are on, the reporters are going to try to provoke division, particularly the body of reporters that we know are in the White House that are anti-Trump. They want to try to accentuate that division in front of the American people. So provocative questions are going to be asked. And the only answer to the question should be, from Zelensky's point, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, America. I'm going to work with you to achieve a peaceful end to this war, period. He must say that 5, 6, 7 times in different words and stay away from anything that smacks of controversy that would divide them. He fell into that trap, and likely right beneath the surface, he obviously has some disagreements with the president and his team. And that is to be expected, but not in the Oval Office. That is done privately, as anybody has said today. The second thing is what the last snippet talked about. Zelensky likely doesn't see this deal, the mineral deal, in the same light that President Trump does. He sees it as a huge strategic deal that connects the United States to Ukraine for a generation at least. It's going to take years of exploration and mining to get all of that out where it's monetized properly. He knows all of that, but it connects him economically to Ukraine, politically to Ukraine, and all the implications in terms of security and military to Ukraine. But Trump does not want to go there on the third thing, prior to negotiations. He knows full well that given the investment the United States is going to make, that he will do what's necessary to protect it. But prior to negotiations with Putin, he's not laying that stuff out on the table. I'm stunned that Zelensky doesn't have an appreciation for who he's dealing with, that he hasn't been briefed in the kind of details that he really has to have. What Zelensky wants is a strategic partnership with Trump, Martha, where they're working together to deal with Putin. And what the president is doing, he is facilitating these negotiations. Zelensky doesn't like that. He wants a partnership. But President Trump believes if he's going to have any progress with Putin, he can't publicly sign up with Zelensky to achieve that. He puts a lot of faith in personal diplomacy that exceeds most presidents I've seen, going all the way back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So that, I think, is some of the divide that's here. And it's really unfortunate that this blows up in the media, certainly. I don't think it's the lost opportunity that we're feeling right now. Why? Because, listen, it is in the U.S. national interest to end this war and to stop Putin in his tracks. It's in Zelensky's national interest. All his people want it. He wants it. All his staff wants it as well. So I think this is recoverable, believe me. But to use a metaphor is obviously something Zelensky doesn't understand. Hold the cards was one that we saw clearly. The ball is really in his court.
Yes.
He has to make amends here. I think he's certainly capable. He seems to be stepping in that right direction. He's canceled some of the things he's supposed to do. And hopefully they get a plan together here to recover the relationship, and let's get on with signing the deal. Trump is right. It is a strategic step in the right direction. Zelenskyy probably sees it more as a financial thing, and the United States trying to get payback in money. He's missing the whole point there.
Yeah, it's clear, and you put it perfectly, that President Trump sees this as an economic prosperity solution for Ukraine that puts them on a footing where they can start to mine some of these resources, get people back to work, get off of the wartime footing, and try to rebuild the country with the United States invested in the country as its own form of security guarantee. And as you say, and it reminds me of what we heard about the blow-up that apparently happened between Scott Bessent and Zelenskyy when the deal was presented to him in the beginning. My country is not for sale. So it feels like President Zelenskyy is looking at this from a very different perspective. Granted, as you laid out perfectly, General, his country was invaded and destroyed, as Vice President Pence said. And there's a lot of pain there, which I think everybody understands. But let's pull up this image, which we just got from the other side of the room here. And the woman, we're told that the woman who you see with her hand at her head is the ambassador of Ukraine as this is unfolding. And I got to believe I would imagine when Zelenskyy got into the back of that car, General, he's thinking, oh, man, I just completely blew that. That was a big mistake. But I think it can be rectified. And I think you're right. It's interesting. Back in 2019, when the president walked out of a deal that they were working on with North Korea, Trump said, sometimes you have to walk. And I think that's a bit of what we saw today in terms of the deal structure and what he hopes will eventually end in a deal here.
Yeah, well, that possibility certainly is there. I mean, even in the deal itself, it talks about a secure Ukraine going forward, economically viable, an independent, sovereign Ukraine. That's in the words, of the mineral deal. And I know for a fact that President Trump has plans that he's not stating publicly that are going to help along those lines. He is neutral in trying to get a peace agreement, but he clearly sees the benefit of a stable, secure Ukraine and stopping Russia in its tracks now so it doesn't expand into Europe, particularly, obviously, in Eastern Europe.
General, quick question for you in terms
of Both of these presidents want the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. How you think Putin sees this? Because I heard you speaking about this morning and about the fact that Putin, they're like, here's what we want. A smaller Ukraine military. You'll only be allowed to have a military of such a size, and it's going to be smaller than it currently is. And we want you to have new elections. This is Putin's wish for Ukraine. Definitely would like to install his own puppet in Ukraine, as he once had a couple of presidencies ago. How do you think Putin views what played out in the Oval Office?
Yeah, well, I think, number one, he's happy to see the friction and the divide between the two presidents play out in a public view. And he thinks he'd likely, if negotiations are going to go forward, he thinks he likely can take advantage of it. But I think there's a second message there, and that's dealing with President Trump. He doesn't put up with any nonsense whatsoever, and he's not going to stand for how he was being treated in the Oval Office. And I think it's less about him is what the office represents in terms of the American people, is where he's coming from. So Putin may likely misread this a little bit. Yeah. But you're absolutely right, Martha. I mean, we've had the second meeting that took place yesterday, and what did Putin put on the table in terms of negotiations? He wants more territory. Right. The 4 provinces that he's concerned about, he only occupies some of it, but he wants all of it. That's what he put on the table. And he has those other things that you just talked about as conditions as well. Those are hardline conditions. I think the jury is still out in terms of whether Putin is truly serious about making a deal, with the implication that if you're going to have an agreement, you're going to have to make some compromise.
Yeah, doesn't sound like they're in that mood quite yet.
I know that one of the and President Trump and his team, they actually want Putin to give up territory. I mean, they're not saying that, but that's what will go on in the negotiations. So yes, hopefully this gets recovered. Zelensky's got to take the action to do that. And I think if he apologizes to the president and the American people, and we can get on with signing this deal,
all right,
because it is strategic and it is in Ukraine's interest, obviously, as well as the United States. And listen, another thing that's here, we have got to appreciate once and for all, the president really wants to stop the killing. The human aspect of this thing is very important to him.
Yeah.
And he always keeps coming back to it.
Does.
He understands the strategic and global implications, to be sure, but he also wants to stop the human suffering that has taken place.
And he talked about a lot on the campaign trail, that this would be a priority. He wanted to end this war, and he is working on that. And that is what we're watching, as rocky as it can be. Sometimes that's the path to solutions. So we hope that that's what we see here. General, thank you so much. Always good to have you with us, General Jack Keane.
Yeah, great talking to you, Mark.
You as well, sir.